Hey guys, it's been a bit of a discovery. I'm going to put this on the Patreon page today on the 7th, and I'll probably put it on YouTube public next week sometime just to maximize my views on this stuff. But I did find the part numbers for the new Talons. So if you go to, let me show you one of the websites I use, Honda Parts House, they actually do have all of these part numbers. And what I did was I put them all up side by side. So I had, four monitors going with all these different part numbers side by side so I could cross-reference them. And I pulled them into one nice spreadsheet for you. If you're going to try to do this yourself, it's important to know that the codes are a little weird. So the 2023 Talon R, that real R, not the RS, which is the old one, is 5A. But the names are the same. It's S2R, S2R, but you got to know it's 5A. That's kind of weird. It's not how it always does it. Please ignore my misspellings. I made this really quickly. I'm not going to fix them. And then if you're trying to find the part numbers for the new four-seater R, that's easy to find. It's S4R 5A, so that makes sense. Everything that's green means that that's a part that's in common across the row. So what you'll see here is that there's a lot of commonalities between the four-seater R and the 2023 R. And that's what I was saying in my last video is I think the reason that the two-seater was changed was in order to have those parts work on the four-seater instead of the other way around. Because it just makes more sense. That is what I have deduced. Okay, so let's work our way through here. So looking at the front lower control arms, we use the right side for everything because if the right's different, the left will obviously be different. And we're just comparing the part numbers. I don't have the dimensions here. I don't have pictures. A lot of these pictures didn't come through. They're not loading yet, but we can tell the part numbers. So the front lower arm is the same between the two-seater R and the four-seater R for 2023. What's interesting is that the front upper arms are different part numbers. My theory here is that the upper arms on the four-seater are beefed up because that's where the shock mounts. So it's carrying the extra weight of a four-seater and two extra passengers. So maybe there's some extra reinforcements, which is why the upper arm has a different part number. But it's safe to say that the width is the same and the geometry is the same because it's using the same front knuckle and it's using the same lower arms. So the geometry's got to be very similar or that just wouldn't work. Maybe they're changing the toe or the caster or the camber slightly with that difference in upper arms. I can't say for sure until I get one in my hands and measure it. Front axles are common and different. So front axles are common between the true 23s, but they are different than the 22 axle. And I'm going to call that the 22 axle because it's a 23 RS, which, like my last video I said, that's really a 22. So we do get new axles, and that explains the change in width. And the knuckles are the same. So the Talon has the same front knuckle that it's always had since 2019. If we go to the rear, we'll see that the rear trailing arms are all different between these three models. And again, I suspect that's because in the rear, that's where the rear shock mounts, and you might need more weight carrying capacity. So there's probably some extra beefed upness on the rear trailing arm for the four-seater, as well as a beefed up sway bar mount, hopefully, because we've broke those before. Um, and then same story here, but kind of opposite. The upper arms are the same for the 23 two-seater and four-seater, and they're different than the 22 two-seater. Rear axle, same story here. It's the same for the 23s, different than the 22, and the rear knuckles are the same. Steering rack, again, same story here. We got a new steering rack for 23, and it's different than the 22. So this might sound like a bunch of part number jargon, but what does this actually tell you? Like, what can you deduce from these changes in part numbers? Well, the first thing I can tell you is that the knuckles are the same. Therefore, they got the improved turning radius largely from a new power steering rack ratio. Um, Shortening the wheelbase helps a little bit, but I bet this made a bigger difference. So that's good to know. We can also tell that the 23R and the 23R4 are essentially using the same suspension geometry. Not all the part numbers are the same, but enough of the part numbers are the same that we can pretty easily tell that they're going to have at least the same amount of rake front and rear compared to each other. Now, what I can't tell you is how much front rake they have versus how much rear rake they have. And that's an important number because that's going to tell you if it'll clear big tires. So we know that the old Talon R, you could run 37s on it with the proper offset without rubbing. This new one, I don't think it's going to clear a 37. It'll probably still clear a 35, but again, we know it's 2.7 inches shorter. It just depends how much of that 2.7 inches came from the front control arms. That's going to tell us how big of a tire it'll turn. As soon as I get my hands on one, I'll take some measurements. I already have measurements of a 2021 R, so we can do a comparison and see how much tire clearance we lost when you go from 22 to 23. The rear is not a tire clearance issue. That's always going to be fine. Um, we know that we got new axles front and rear on the 23 compared to 22, and that's because when they took that rake out of the suspension, the old R axles would have been too long, so they had to make new axles front and rear. And the fact that it has new axles front and rear tells us that they probably took some rake out of the rear and some rake out of the front. I don't know the exact ratio, but again, it looks like it was changed front and rear. So these part numbers are cool. They tell you a little bit, but they don't tell you the whole story. Really got to get a tape measure to figure out the rest of it. But this will be helpful for you guys if you buy one of these models. These are the part codes you need to search when you're on. I use Ron Ayers or Partzilla or Honda Parts Tester as the cheapest, but you'll go to 2023 and you'll see this whole list of side-by-sides. These are all Talons over here. It took me quite a while to dig through here and figure out which one was which by comparing part numbers and diagrams and stuff. But the four-seater R is easy to find. The two-seater R, not so much. It's kind of buried in these codes at the end, these five ACs, A and AC. That's the that's the two-seater R, the actually new one, not the S model. So I wish Honda would have made these codes a little more obvious.